where they interviewed all three of them, and two of the three agreed on how they got started, and Steve Stills insisted it wasn't that way. And so not everybody's going to agree, and we might have some differences tonight. I've invited, it was a pretty interesting story, and I was also triggered by a visit we had earlier this year from Brad Schaefer and a group of grad students at UCLA who had a semester project to try and figure out how to establish a new reserve. I don't know whether it was a hypothetical exercise or whether they have something up their sleeve, but they came down for a day and toured around and asked all kinds of questions about the operation here and how it happened. And so in thinking back on it, I thought it was a pretty interesting story, and it's gotten more interesting as I've talked to the group that's here tonight. And we've invited Rick Rayburn, who was the chief of the Natural Resources Division for California State Parks. And he and Dr. Alex Glazer, who was the former head of was the director of the UC Natural Reserve System for 13 years. And in 2007, they put their heads together, and they'll talk a little bit about what came out of it. And Al Bennett from UC Irvine, who was the dean of the Division of Biological Sciences at the time that this first started to germinate, and was instrumental in shepherding it along and getting it established. And Dr. Marjorie Beale, who was the chief fundraiser from the University Advancement at UC Irvine at the time, and she's the one who wrangled up all the money and made it happen. And believe me, this place is a testament to what you can do if you have a few $1 million. And Violet Nakayama, who many of you know, she was an attorney for the UC Natural Reserve System for how many years? 20 some odd years. Well, wait, Peter was standing too. You might not have seen him. And I was standing, and she did a wonderful job to get it all through. And we're missing a couple of people tonight, and I'd like to take a minute and explain who they are. Up until last week, Diane Pataki, who was our first faculty director, and she told me the story on the phone the other day of how Al roped her into that, and it was a classic case of saying too much and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she made the mistake of telling Al that she was on her way to Borrego to go camping when he first sent the thing around, and she'd take a couple of pictures. Well, she came down, she took a couple of pictures and sent them back to Al, and she became the faculty director. And she was great to work with, and unfortunately she still hasn't seen the final product. She moved to University of Utah right as we were concluding the first phase of renovations after we purchased this place. And so I was looking forward to being able to show her around, and she's never seen the dorms or the classroom laboratory, efficiency units and everything. And so she was all set to come, and then a good friend of hers with the National Science Foundation passed away a week ago this weekend, and memorial service was today, so we completely understood her change of plans. Another very important part of the equation that is not here tonight is Mrs. Jerry Hansen, who was the representative of Aubrey Steele Burnand, the donor for this project. And Mrs. Hansen was a great friend of this place right up until the time she passed away last December. So maybe Marjorie and I can fill in some of those details as we go along here, but she was a big part of bringing in the money and getting the support to do this. And the other people in the photograph up here, Mrs. Burnand in the upper right-hand corner, Audrey Steele Burnand, was the person who provided the $4 million that made this happen. That's her high school graduation picture. She went to a private school in Pasadena. And that's the only picture that exists on the internet of Audrey Steele Burnand. It's the only picture she's willing to turn loose of right now. Her son has told me that he will get me some other pictures, but that's all I got to work with at the moment. And that's her father-in-law to her left there, A.A. Burnand Jr. And her parents, Harry and Grace Steele, in the lower left. So Mrs. Burnand came by her money from both her father-in-law, who invested heavily in agriculture and real estate when he first, I think he graduated from UC. Apparently went to Stanford and UC Davis, and he graduated. He was in the 1932 Olympics in a one of the rowing events, and moved to Borrego in the late 30s, started an agricultural empire, I guess you could say, and got connected with the DiGiorgio Corporation, and eventually the Burnands, the DiGiorgios, and the Kurtz all intermarried and became a tangled web. But he, a lot of his land over the years has been donated to the park, and it turned out he was the leader of a group of investors who commissioned this building in the first place, and which made it attractive to Mrs. Burnand to when we approached her. But and Harry and Grace Steele. Harry Steele was invested in an electrical motor company early in the century, and did quite nicely, providing electrical motors apparently to agriculture, and also I've read refrigerators when they first started. And his corporation, I don't think was all that big until Emerson Electric bought it out sometime in the 50s, and then the stock went through the roof. And so Mrs. Burnand came from money on both sides of her family, and she wanted the place named for her parents and her father-in-law. When she said her father-in-law, her parents introduced her to the desert, and her father-in-law gave her the desert, which I took to mean all of the land that wound up in her hands after both her father-in-law and her husband passed on. So that's the short version. Mrs. Hansen was Mrs. Burnand's right-hand person for 40 years, all the way up until her death. Mrs. Burnand is still alive at age 95 and living in Newport Beach, and pretty much reclusive. We've never seen her. In fact, during the negotiations for this place and the donation and stuff, it became, there are some people at UCI that began to think that Mrs. Hansen was actually Mrs. Burnand. It was sort of like Batman and what's his name, Bruce Wayne. So Mrs. Hansen is not going to be with us tonight, and Diane Pataki is not going to be with us, but I think we got a great representation of all the rest of the story here, and I'm going to let Rick kick it off with what was going through his mind back in 2007.
Yay, Rick! Wow, thanks, Jim. It is so great to be here. I remember, like 21 years ago, starting to work for State Parks, I met Marjorie for the first time, and I said, "Where are you from?" And he goes, "God's country." And here we are, we return to God's country. And it's just so cool to be with you guys and see this place, which I haven't seen. And I'm probably maybe the earliest contributor to this, although my contribution wasn't all that much and compared to the rest of many. But first, let me tell you, as I retired from state parks, natural resources, I started writing because that was one of the weakest things in my background. So I was writing short stories and poems. And there's a phenomenon in writing short stories or poems. One of my poetry teachers refers to it as volta. My daughter, who is a poet, says, no, it's the writing process. But there's this phenomenon when you get started on a short story or a poem, when your main idea through rewrites, drafts, not new vocabulary, but looking for more environmentally laden words, not environmentally, emotionally laden words, the whole idea switches. Whereas the characters, the setting may be the same, but the whole point of the poem changes. I did a poem on Mazatlan last year. It was a trip in 1967. Four of us took to Mazatlan. My idea was, this is a great trip we took. It was a wild weekend in Easter break, and I would write about that. It was very, memorable. And as I got down to it, going through it, I started thinking more and more. In the back of my mind came forward this idea, or this saying, this quote. And I'm going to say it because it was so beautiful, but it was not on my mind at all when I came up with the idea of writing this poem about Mazatlan. And it was a 75-year-old Mexican man pushing a cart with food. And we were in a tent the first night, and it was like 6:30, 7 in the morning. We hear, pan, leche, banana, vanilla. And this thing was, as in the back of my mind, it came out as I was thinking about this poem I was writing. So the poem shifted totally to sounds of the Mexican coastal tropics from a tent during Easter week. The whole idea of drinking beer and carousing and having a great old time was gone. It was all about the sounds that came forward. Later, a month later, I was writing a poem, which I dedicated to Dick Troy and Dave Van Cleve, who many of you may know, about San Onofre. My idea initially was, and this is after the nuclear power plant had been decommissioned because of the disaster in Japan and earlier Chernobyl. And so I was going to write about the damage that had been done in early 60s to San Onofre when Dick was a park ranger at San Onofre State Beach. And as I was going through that, and I began to rewrite it, many rewrites, thinking about this time, things in the back of my mind came forward. And really what then emerged was, that wasn't such an important story to me. It was about my grandfather who took me surf fishing there and who played cribbage with me, taught me cribbage and played cribbage with me. And the poem evolved to that, something that wasn't anticipated to begin with. Well, that is the story of this unit initially from my perspective. One noon, I decided not to go out for a walk in downtown Sacramento. I put my feet up on my desk. I remember my feet were there, which I normally don't do. And I was reading a natural resources report on the values of Tejon Ranch. And in there, like on page 74, was this reference to Dr. David Wake, who declared part of Tejon Ranch as an evolutionary hotspot. And I kept reading, I went, wait, evolutionary hotspot? What did I just see? I had never heard of that. My reason for looking at this report was I got involved in Tejon, and I was primarily involved in acquisition of natural resources for California state parks. So I wanted to find out what the values of Tejon. So I'm just reading this term, evolutionary hotspots. So I get really excited about this, thinking in light of climate change, evolutionary hotspots, what can be more critical to long-term preservation than evolutionary hotspots, whatever the hell they were, I didn't know. So I called up Alex, and who I had many years experience on the Biodiversity Council. And Alex knew David Wake because he was a faculty advisor to the Natural Preserve System. And so between Alex and David Wake and the director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at Berkeley, a two-day symposium was put together of conservation or evolutionary biologists from all over the DC system. Some of you were there. There's 15 of you that were there, and the whole idea was to explore this concept of evolutionary hotspots for the purpose of establishing some priorities for expenditures of the $3.5 billion bond that was about to be passed and dispersed in California. So we spent 2 days exploring this concept of these evolutionary hotspots in California. My goal was to develop a map to find out where are these priority areas, see how they match up with existing protected lands, and move forward with that. That was what was on my mind. But through talking to Alex and David and a couple other folks, they said, would you come talk to the natural, what was it, the natural preserve, I want to call it the faculty advisors group, but what I don't know about it was about 30 folks that represented your reserves and preserves. And there I spoke a little bit about these hotspots and my thoughts as far as race to bond. But I began to understand for the first time more about your system of preserved lands and what was going on and the large ramifications of being involved with research in these areas. And at the same time, I was getting requests from Mark Jorgensen and Jim Dice from Borrego for $4 million to advance some studies of mountain lion in Borrego and Cuyamaca studies. And they kept reminding me, Rick, half of the research is done in the state park system is done in Borrego. You really need to get behind this. And so research was on my mind that day. I was at the National Preserve System and began to talk to these folks about this. And slowly, not slowly, very quickly, my whole emphasis and interest evolved from evolutionary hotspots to the Natural Preserve System of UC as it related to research for California state parks, specifically at Anza-borrego Desert State Park. So after talking to Alex and getting this concept in mind and feeling this excitement about it, I called Mark. Mark wasn't around. I talked to Jim Dice. I said, what would you guys think about totally anticipating the reaction being, hey man, we are really busy and you want us to do what, get together with who and put together this thing that we don't even know anything about, And the response was, this is great. This is so cool. You bet we want to do this. And Jim said, I'll get back to you. He talked to Mark and Mike Wells, another manager in the area, and it was like, hey, we're in. And quickly there was a meeting in Irvine, University of campus on Irvine. 15 professors, deans. I think Jim was there. I'm not sure. I think Mark was there from state parks, and it was this first meeting of how can we put this together. There was nothing but excitement about it, that we could make this work, which was relatively new in those, not relatively new, but it's rare in those days you'd see people come together with such excitement and determination. And that was all I did, attend that meeting with that earlier thought. And I stepped out because all these folks in this thing carried the ball and ran with it. So I bring this up because it's a little bit of history, but also I wanted to emphasize here to you that you can go forward with an idea you think is pretty good and talk to people about it. And you may hesitate at first, maybe, well, I'm not going to do this, I'm not sure they've got me a chance. But if you move forward with the right people, with a good idea, even if that good idea doesn't come forward, something else cool is likely to come about just through discussions, contemplation of things that you have in common that could serve the greater good. And that was how this whole idea got started. That's it. Thanks for Are you ready?
You realize that anyone who follows a presentation like this is a major disadvantage. But anyway, what I do want to tell you is that I had
Bring it in there.
Okay, I'll try.
No, bring it in.
Lollipop it out. Ice cream.
Many of you will remember.
Is it on there?
Many of you will remember that we had these meetings for reserve managers, which were held, generally speaking, with as few faculty present as humanly possible. And they were generally not clamoring for being included. So I would get up, and I had always given a little thought to having these presentations being uplifting. So I didn't say, I'm terribly sorry, but we've just failed to get the funding for the following things, and we're going backwards. This would be sure to do something negative about the atmosphere, the future aspects. And so you always look for something positive. And you've got a lot of justification for it, because the areas you want to protect are vanishing about as rapidly as possible. And the problems you want to address are not necessarily the most interesting problems for the general public, because you're no longer doing applied research, which is what divided us from looking at agriculture and natural resources. Because their objective is to increase yields, to enlarge the areas of ground that could be used for agriculture instead of being wasted by having all these weeds growing on it and so on. So I was always on the lookout for something positive. And this is what happened. This is the most positive thing that could have possibly happened. Because there were a number of problems which the natural reserve system had that could be solved by mutual understanding by state parks and the reserve system. And Rick turned out to be the perfect arbitrator of such events, because he was highly respected within the parks. And we needed help, so we highly respected him automatically, because he was helping us. And this was a strange phenomenon, because mostly we had a very hard time trying to get something done. There were political angles to it and so on. So the bottom line is, Rick made things possible. And our strongest weapon in convincing people that the reserve system matters is to have them experience the reserve system. They have to talk to people, go and look at the place, talk to the people who are working there, and see if the magic of the place takes over. If it doesn't take over, that actually should make you think very, very hard, because you're not looking after that area properly. Because most of these reserves were obtained by either using very, very limited amounts of funds or as gifts. And more of them were given as gifts in the early years of the reserve system than anything else. So this gift is, so to speak, the apex of the pyramid. And I think it's a wonderful way to finish up. So this area is worth knowing something about. It's 700,000 acres. And in this area, you have an extraordinary variation in geological features, also in biological features. And even an artificial contraption like the Salton Sea is an interesting thing to see, because it tells you something. It's a tremendous lesson to learn when you decide you're going to fight nature and you start selling Colorado River water. And we could go through this over and over. So, from my point of view, first of all, it's a tribute to persistence, because I have talked to my colleague, and Diane Bataki said this was one of the hardest things she had ever done, because she was offered a rise to a tenured position in Utah, and she couldn't just pick up and leave because she was responsible for this project. And that's a fact. And she did very well by presenting this to both, as we will find out, as both to the people on campus, because she energized the campus. She didn't make a mistake of calling faculty from a limited number of departments. She called them in from every department on campus that was interested in participating, and the turnout she got is little short of phenomenal. Departments that never talk to one another, you may not realize this, but most departments are like islands. They, on principle, don't talk to anybody else. And here he broke this unknown drive to separation. It turns out maybe it's not permanent, maybe it's sort of a temporary disease. So anyhow, she did extremely well and deserves a tremendous amount of credit. And Rick, of course, knew all the people here, and the outcome was very, very good. So the take-home lesson from all of this is that every reserve we have in the system and every success we have is driven at a critical point by somebody whose talents are needed. And I hope that this is sort of illustrated by the other presentations that you're going to have here. But I think I found it a privilege to work for the Natural Reserve System because of the level of idealism, by and large. Even when there was tremendous pessimism, like when I was dealing with Dan Dawson, his standard comment was to say, you can't justify starting a new reserve when we are perpetually short of money. So it's an equation, right? There's no reason to give you more money because you've already done whatever you can to squeeze it out of the system. You haven't succeeded. So you basically feel this wasn't a great thing. So you say, well, I'm not going to have somebody else succeed. So you just crunch them. So you have to realize that there are human feelings, there are personality things and so on. But somewhere along the line there is a chord. And you reach that chord, and hopefully it turns out that it, shall we say, the altruistic part of humanity treadmills or overcomes jealousy. And I will pass this on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Alex. My involvement with the Natural Reserve System of the University of California, I guess, could be considered embryonic, because back in 1963, I was an undergraduate at the Riverside campus of the university, and I was fortunate enough to secure a research position as an undergraduate with Dr. Bill Mayhew there. And we went out in the desert all of the time. I mean, that's really, Bill was really why I became the kind of biologist that I became, and fell in love with the University of California, and pretty much devoted my life to it afterwards. But Bill, in coming out to the deserts, had this vision about seeing the development, seeing things going away, of preserving the different areas where research and nature could carry on within the existing different environments and ecosystems within California. And anyway, I moved on from there. I eventually came to UC Irvine as a faculty member in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Became a chair of that department. And then I became a dean and of that school. And along the way, we had a couple of properties within the natural reserve system, but nothing like a lot of the other campuses did. I was always very impressed with the system and wished that we had more contact with it. What we did have contact with, however, was our local state park, Crystal Cove. And we had established both a research relationship with that state park and an educational relationship. And that was just really going well. We thought, you know, this is really a perfect marriage between the University of California and the state parks of California. And so this is great. And then what we alluded to here previously was that Anza-borrego became interested in having a natural reserve presence of the university, natural reserve presence of the university here, and we kind of pricked up our ears and said, hey, this is, you know, this could be good. This could be really good for us and something that we want to investigate and support. So we came down, we talked about it on campus. We had this meeting on our campus and began exploring with people down here, with the Anza-borrego Foundation, with local people, and we came down and gave a presentation to local businessmen and bankers and within Imperial County, and talked to them about this ideal about we wanted to have a research presence for the University of California down here in partnership with the state park. That in particular meeting went nowhere in and of itself. But then in the meantime, we recognized that the property that you are sitting in now came on the market. This used to be a country club, and things got hot, things dried up, and eventually the property was sold to individual business interests. And it became a kind of, one could say, antique shop, or one could say junk shop. The owner of that had this place chock full of tchotchkes that nobody would ever want. And he decided to sell it, and it came on the market. And there was a lot of consternation in this area, in town, with, well, you know, if an individual buys this, they're just going to gut the place. Maybe they're going to tear it down and build some kind of, you know, McMansion on top of it. And we really don't want to lose that. It's such a unique and historic space for Borrego Springs. And so we became very involved with trying to promote this particular property. And for an instant here, I'm going to turn the mic back over to Jim to tell you exactly how the contact was made. Jim?
Well, this is one of those places where you can't always believe what you read and stuff. And, you know, you can still go on the internet and see a story that I met Mrs. Burnand in the parking lot at the post office here in Borrego Springs, and she forked over $4 million. And it's not exactly the way it happened. And after the meeting at Imperial Valley with the cattlemen and bankers, and that went nowhere, that Alex was just alluding to, I had talked to Marjorie, and Mrs. Burnand was known to the university. I believe she had a daughter that attended UCI, and what was that? Oh, her son went here too? Okay. I was going to say, I don't think the son ever actually went to college. Okay. Anyway, Mrs. Burnand was known as a donor to UCI, but she was in her late 80s at the time, and she had notified the university as well as some others, including she was still a big donor to the community here. Many things, the Boys and Girls Club, the school system. I knew of her through Little League when I was Little League president, and I would go to Mrs. Hanson with a request every year, and Little League would have died a long time ago in Borrego Springs if it wasn't for Mrs. Burnand. But so I told Marjorie, you know, that I didn't think it would hurt, and that the one thing I knew about dealing with Mrs. Hanson was that we would know pretty quickly whether it had any legs or not. That she was not bashful about letting you know if your project was going nowhere, and at least in terms of funding for Mrs. Burnand. So Marjorie sent me the same brochure that we had taken to the cattlemen and the bankers in Imperial Valley, and I did lay an ambush at the post office. Post office is one place in Borrego that sooner or later you will see everybody, and there's no home mail delivery here, so pretty much everybody has to go there at some point to pick up their mail. And so I happened to be there a few days after that when I saw Jerry pull in at the same time I was there, and I was carrying this brochure around with me, and so I went and talked to her, and I told her I had this and I would like her to take a look at it. And she was polite and took a look at it, and I think we were all totally ignorant at that point that it was Mr. Burnand, her father-in-law, who had commissioned this building originally. And so I remember going home that night and calling Marjorie and saying, I'm not sure, but I think this might have some legs, that she seemed genuinely interested in it and stuff. And I'll let Marjorie pick it up from there.
All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of backtracking here and maybe even a little bit of summarizing, because Rick started out talking about things that begin one way and they take many, many turns and they turn out to be something quite different from what you initially envisioned. And Alex has talked a little bit about emotion and how people have a lot of feelings about things, and politics, and how personalities really matter. Al has evoked his days as a student and how he worked in the Natural Reserve System learning things. And so what I'm going to talk about brings all of those things together. So when I first heard about this project, it was from a woman who is now retired from UC Irvine, who was our Vice Chancellor for Research, Sue Bryant. And one day she called me up and she said, Marjorie, I've got this really interesting project. We have people from the Natural Reserve System of UC who've picked us as the ideal campus to do this partnership with the Anza-borrego Desert State Park. And she says, there's also a foundation out there that makes land donations, and they want to work with us too. So would you go out and figure out how to make this happen? I said, oh, that sounds good. So I was all excited. Yay, field trips. So I was all excited. And then I met Diane Pataki, who was like the coolest person I'd ever met. She's about 12 or 15 years younger than me and rode a motorcycle with chaps. And she was just so cute and so smart. And I was like, oh, you're awesome. Okay, we're going to make the dynamic duo. So we came out here and we checked out the place, and we had many, many meetings. This is when I first met Jim, when I first met Mark Jorgensen, I met Kathy Dice, I met Gail Severance, I met all kinds of people who are legend around here. And we sat, we talked, and we talked, and we talked about what should go in this MOU, and we had people come over from the Anza-borrego Foundation, we talked with them, we went through several different executive directors and, you know, many, many permutations as we talked about this one piece of property that was right near the state park where we were going to build this $7 million facility. So we had this great vision, and we had figured out a whole government relations strategy whereby we were going to get Prop 84 funds through the intervention of a state representative who was down in El Centro. We worked on this, and we were kind of counting on it for a couple of years. And we were asked to look at the RFP. Diane and I reviewed it, and we kind of sent our comments forward. And then eventually we were invited to come up and meet with representatives of I think the Prop 84, or was it State Parks? I think it was State Parks that was issuing this RFP. And we talked to them about what we wanted to do. And they said, no. What we wanted was a visitor center. We just want an additional visitor center. I said, wouldn't you consider doing a visitor center with researchers? So people can learn about how scientific research is really done. They were like, go away, we don't want to see your proposal, don't even bother to write it, just scram. And so we went back with our tails tucked between our legs. We came back to Borrego, and we're talking with our friends at State Parks about this. And Gail Severance looked at me and she says, there's this property. We should go talk to the real estate lady. So we got the real estate lady, and she took us all around town and said, let me show you a bunch of properties. So there was one total party pad somewhere out of town that looked really fantastic, and they'd done a lot of work on it. We thought, this isn't it. And then we came here and looked at it and went, this could work. It was really quite beautiful, and it was empty, and we thought, do a few things to this, and this really could be good. And so we started trying to figure out, okay, now that we've identified this house, this could be so much cheaper than doing this $7 million, construction de novo kind of project. Surely this will work. So, Marjorie, go find us some money. And I thought, $750,000? No problema, I can find that money. So then I dragged Al, and I dragged Diane, and I dragged all kinds of people out all through the desert. We went to El Centro, we talked to the watermen, and we talked to the Imperial Irrigation District. We talked to everybody you can imagine. We talked to the Rabobank. Oh my goodness. Nobody wanted to give us anything. So this was getting a little bit discouraging. And I was starting to feel like, I'm losing some credibility here. Uh-oh, what am I going to do? But I remembered, back in my days as a foundation relations person, I had looked at a database once, and I saw there was this thing called the A. Burnand Educational and Medical Research Foundation. I thought, it's based in Borrego, and all those cattle people told us, and water people and ranchers and stuff from El Centro just said, Borrego's a rich town. When we see that some of your people put some money into this, then we'll consider contributing. So I was just, as Jim was reporting a little while ago, we got to talking, and he said, well, there's this nice lady who gives us money for the Little League, Jerry Hansen. And at the same time, back in Newport Beach, I'd been talking to one of our volunteers, a guy named Bill Ficker, who knew all the yachtsmen in the Newport Beach area. And he said, I know this guy, Robert Burnand, maybe he'll give this to his mother. So I had this proposal, and I gave it to Robert Burnand, and at the same time I gave it to Jim to give to Jerry Hansen. So all of a sudden, right around Christmas, Mrs. Burnand received my proposal twice from two different sources, once from her son and once from her closest advisor. And after that, sometime in January, I got a call from Jerry Hansen. She said, hello, and she introduced herself and said, I want to talk to you about this proposal. She said, I'm in Costa Mesa right now. Can you come over and meet me for breakfast at this motel? And I was like, okay. So I drove over to this motel in Costa Mesa and met her for breakfast. And our first encounter was over fried eggs. She's like, you look nervous, why don't you eat something? So I sat there and had fried eggs and toast, and we talked. And she let me know that Mrs. Burnand was really interested in this project, and that she was, willing to help us buy the building. So then I went back to the new Vice Chancellor for Research, a guy named John Heminger. And I said, I think I've got a gift for you for $750,000. He goes, that's not enough, because what I need you to know is at this time, the UC system was just facing horrible budget cuts as a result of the economic crash. Al, you look like you want to add something.
Yes. This is 2008. And this was the time when the state began divesting itself of the University of California, and ultimately we sustained a 30% budget cut from the state. When I was a student and an undergraduate, 50% of the budget of the University of California was provided by the state of California. Now it's closer to 10. So what we received from our campus was no, no, no. You never take a gift that eats. And Diane and Marjorie and I got together and said, to hell with them. Well, let's go ahead anyway And you, Marjorie, are going to have to go back to Audrey and explain the financial situation of the University of California right now, and that there has to be additional funds in order to support this project beyond the purchase of the property. Otherwise, the University of California is not going to be able to deal with this.
High drama, in other words. So, at this point, my husband's sitting in the second row, and he will tell you at one point, I looked at him and I said, I would walk through a pane of glass to get this done. I must get this done. This has to happen. So I went back to my donor. I drove out here again, and I said, Jerry, help me. We're so grateful that you want to give us $750,000, but I just spoke with our vice chancellor, and we're in an unprecedented situation at the University of California. Because of all the budget cuts, our campus has been asked to take a 10% cut. Ordinarily, we would front the money to do the renovation, so we would just worry about raising it later, but now we can't. And she said, well, okay. I said, so I'm wondering, would Mrs. Burnand be willing to help make some introductions? So I came with a big, long list of all these people associated with Borrego who might donate, people who were associated with the Anza-borrego Foundation, and she said, oh, let me show this list to Audrey. So she came back to me about a week later. She says, Audrey says she doesn't know any of these people, and she says, I want to do it all myself. She says, how much did you say it was going to cost to do this? And I said, well, it's $750,000 to buy the property. It's going to be $2 million altogether to buy and renovate, and $4 million to buy, renovate, and endow. She said, let us think about that a little bit. So a couple weeks later, I get this phone call. She says, she just looked at me. She goes, that's not off the table. And I was like, oh. So, yeah. So a few weeks later, I met Jerry in the parking lot of that motel in Costa Mesa, and she handed me a check for $4 million. And I ran back to UC Irvine, and I made a photocopy of this thing, and I scanned it, and I sent it to everybody who'd been working on this project, which was quite a few people at this point, and was receiving congratulations all day long. I put it in the lockbox, and I'm like, oh, we did it. And then there was even another phase after that, because what you're looking at here, this was phase one, and John Heminger got his endowment, so our project doesn't eat anything from the budget. It just takes care of itself very nicely. But then after that, Diane and I realized, along with a whole lot of other people, that there was still money left from Prop 84 that had been given to the Natural Reserve System, and this is where Violet's going to come in. So then we had a lovely young woman who'd been hired by Al, named Cassie Rouser, who worked really hard on this proposal. She's now at UCLA running one of their Grand Challenge programs related to the urban environment, so she's moved on to bigger and better things. But she and I and a whole lot of other people then worked on this proposal to the NRS, and then we handed it over to Violet. So I will hand it over to Violet.
So before I start, you know that I retired about 4 years ago, and now my husband retired 3 months ago. So 29 days ago, or rather 31 days ago, we started a road trip, something we could never do because he, was director of Boyd for 35 years. Anyway, last week, just a few days ago, I got a message from Jim Dice and Elaine. Here's the final program. And I happened to click on the program because, I'm retired, and I saw my name on tonight's. So Jim will know that I immediately wrote him back and said, Jim, I think it's a mistake. I don't know why you put me down, but could you please remove my name? Well, he didn't, so here I am. So, and it'll be brief, because let me tell you, legal things are so boring. So, after all of this wonderful negotiations had taken place, it was this role of system-wide office, and as the attorney, I prepared all of the documents that were needed, the memorandum of understanding with the state parks, but as you had mentioned, it was not 2 parties, it was 3 parties. It was also a foundation, a nonprofit organization. So it got a little more complicated. We got a wonderful MOU done and basically what it said was, yes, we're going to work together, we're going to become partners, and we want to establish a new NRS reserve. And that was critically important, because without a formal creation of a reserve or intent to create a new reserve, it's hard to get funding, it's hard to get commitments from the campus, donors, etc. And what some of you may know, but not all, is that every single one of our 39 reserves have had a Regents item. That is to say, we needed Regents approval by the UC board in order to create a new NRS unit. And so when Rayburn and Alex got together, and the campus too, and decided, yeah, let's go for it, the first thing we did was to get the MOU, and I went to the Regents, or our office went, but it was Alex and me kind of preparing the document, to get their blessing. And we did in 2008, and that enabled, and that didn't create a new reserve, but we said we're going to cooperate, and through this cooperation, our intention is to move forward and get funding and support for a permanent reserve. And because of that Regents item, all the campus and the rest is history. We have funding, we have donors, etc. It also was critically important in the campus having access to Prop 84 funds, because they couldn't do it without being an NRS reserve. So that was a condition that had to be met. So that was 2008 for the MOU, and then 2011, when we had funding and everything was secured, I also prepared a second Regents item. And there, we proposed to the Regents that, here, please, accept the gift of land, gift of an endowment, and also please approve the naming Steele Burnand. And yes, absolutely, and the Anza-borrego Foundation also made a gift of about 17 acres or something like that, the original one. 70, yeah. So it used to be Burnand. So it was this wonderful, this final spectacular ending is this reserve that every piece of the puzzle fit together. And it doesn't always happen, as you know, because many reserves are still waiting for their, what is it? Their fairyland, yeah, it's the land for this one. But anyway, so that's all I have.
Let's see if there are any questions.
Yeah, do you have questions for any of us? Yes?
So, I probably should have asked Jim this a while ago, but what's the policy with the state park in terms of streamlining permitting for researchers? How does a researcher?
That's part of my job.
It is, but how does it? Obviously, we've had other reserves who are in cooperative agreements with national parks and other entities struggle with that. How's it working here?
Well, I think it's working okay. I mean, Gina Moran, who succeeded me at the park as the senior environmental scientist, I remember ironically when we entered into this that I was the state park's senior environmental scientist. Mike Wells was the district superintendent, and we were the two named in the MOU as the ones that would be approving permits and stuff. And the faculty were very concerned about time limits, and and it was spelled out in there that we had 30 days to review and comment and get back to them. And I remember trying to assure Diane Pataki that I had been on all sides of this issue. I had been a graduate student researcher and had run afoul of the National Park Service and being told that if I wanted to work in Grand Canyon, I should have thought about it a year and a half before I wanted to be there, and that we were the two that were going to be approving permits, and that we would do our damnedest to make sure that it went through on a speedy and within the 30 days. And yeah, there would be some hiccups because Diane talked a lot about doing restoration where she would maybe scrape off a piece of land and observe and measure what came back, and so that's probably not going to happen within the state park. But we can work with you to try and identify other lands nearby that we might be able to do it.
Is that actually written into an MOU, the 30-day?
Yes,
Have you got it?
there actually is a timeline in the MOU. Ironically, both Mike and I retired, and now I find myself in a position that Diane was sort of in, trying to work with individual researchers. The permitting process has gotten considerably more tighter, and I might even say a little convoluted, but Gina is great to work with, and we have worked successfully on trying to get, I think our biggest hiccup right now is the requirement for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife permit and the length of time that they take to actually approve something. And I was just working on that today with an entomologist from the University of Connecticut. We're trying to get through that hurdle so he can work there again next spring. But part of my job is to work with individual researchers and Gina to try and make sure that everybody's got everything they need to be able to work in the park.
Yes.
I do have 78 acres around here that I have to say so.
If my memory serves me correctly, we had worked this out with Crystal Cove State Park for our campus about being able to do research there, what kinds of campus approval, what kinds of state park approval would be needed. And then when this came up, we shipped down our MOU document down here, and I think you would have modified it, but I think that there at least was something to work with at the beginning for that, before this arrangement came about.
Let me say something about that subject. I, in the Natural Resources Division, each year review all of the research that's being done in the state park system. It all stuff came through Jim as the ecologist, and Borrego came up to us. Not for any purpose other than keeping track of knowing how much research was being done, where, and for what purpose. And I was always interested in seeing how is what's being done, can that benefit California or more specifically the state park system in terms of what needs to be done in terms of stewardship. And the one thing that you guys can do that really helps, it was at the time, that time, 8 years ago, that was really a thorn on our side, was the 85% failure in turning in reports after the research was done. And the ecologists, like Jim and others in the field, they didn't have time to go after these and say, hey, where's the report? Keep on track of that. And so the amount of reports that weren't being turned in was staggering. So we put forward an effort with you people like you and others, let's get these in. We're working together on this thing. And that did improve. It was successful, but it's going to be an ongoing problem. It's probably one of the last things you want to do is prepare the report that gets turned into state parks.
Most of the managers have that same issue of getting people that are researching at their place, getting the reports out of them. So it's a universal.
One thing I want to add to that is that was one thing that began to improve. The other thing was Victoria Sork, who's now I think the dean of whatever at UCLA. Victoria was Valley Oak expert in California, and she came to us and said, I have to go to like 8 or 10 parks, and each year for Valley Oaks, I got to pay an entrance fee, and it's kind of a pain and whatever. So we were able to, and I hope it's still going on, to provide for waivers of entrance fees and improvements in maybe accommodations for staying in parks, because we really want you, and we want to make that happen. So I hope that's still happening. But Victoria set off.
And you do have a system where if it's more than one district involved, they can get a statewide permit.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they don't have to get permits from every single park. They can go through Sacramento and get a statewide permit. It's supposed to be done.
Yeah, just thank you for the segue to our session tomorrow morning. One of my projects at Orange Coast right now is to test this out. I'm working with Travis and Megan on setting the template for this kind of partnership relationship when it comes to research, and make sure that that's a benefit to both sides and address the things that Rick's talking about. And make that template we hope that we can then follow with every campus, both in the UC and the CSUs. So that is actually a project that I'm being tasked with as part of my duties, and we'll talk all about that in the morning, but we hear you, and you heard our side too. It's like, whatever happened to these 47 permits? Did anybody ever finish this? What happened to these?
Well, I mean,
Is the research, is it applicable to our management needs? And work that out, as well as, are we giving you also an opportunity to actually, tell the public about what you're finding about from this research, and show the public the benefit of us letting you have no parking fees and access to our facilities. So that's all part of what we're trying to set in the template of our new organization. So we'll talk about that tomorrow morning. So thanks for doing that.
And another site like the what Jim Andre brought up was, recently I had a researcher from the University of Utah working on wood rats and their digestive system and enzymes, and somehow protection from toxins in plants. And she came and wanted to work here and wanted to, but she needed to take 24 wood rats. I told her that's never going to happen. I mean, that's never going to get permitted by the state parks. If you can get BLM, which is what we were always told to do, is to flex people away from the state parks. So she was able to, they used us as a base for, what did they say? I think 8 days. Started out it was going to be 3, but they had car problems and they were also having wood rat problems. And, they wound up staying for 8 days, and they did have all the necessary permits, including through the UC Riverside, where this student, researcher at Steele, had approved their IACO permit. And so they traveled out to the Fish Creek area and up to the Oral Flame Canyon area and worked in BLM lands, and were able to get the specimens they needed, and hopefully they're all safe back in Utah for a while.
I had a quick question. That was with the Anza-borrego Foundation. Their mission is to acquire land for transfer to state parks. Was there any difficulty in getting it to go to UC?
Why, yes, there was. This was actually an unprecedented act on the part of the Anza-borrego Foundation, and they debated it long and thought very carefully about what they wanted to do, and in the end decided that because the land was going to be in some way protected by the University of California, because it was joining the natural reserve system, even though our plan was to conduct research there, which would sometimes cause disruptions to the ecosystem, to the creatures, to everything else, there was still a high enough standard of protection and a worthy enough cause that they said, we're going to make an exception this once for the first time in our history, and we're going to donate this land to the University of California. But it was quite a conversation. It went on. Here.
There are.
Can I say one more thing about the foundation? Another very important goal of theirs is education, public education. And that was critically important in having them partner with us because, as you know, UC is research, teaching, and public outreach. And the foundation has a fabulous public K-12, perhaps, science and beyond, program.
They did put an attachment to that deal where they gave us the 74 acres that we're not to build anything on that. It's to be left in such a condition that if the university were to ever walk away, it would revert back to the foundation and presumably to state parks. We were able to do that because it was land they held that had not yet been transferred to state parks. If it had been state park system, it never was. I would have taken an act of the legislature and then went back to Beale. And so,
Are you pursuing more land acquisitions to do that?
not at the moment, the stuff that's been offered to us, I mean, I don't know that there's a whole lot of money for it. I did talk to Travis and Mark Warner in the Office of Research about the property that goes down from us along the main drive, but it's a narrow strip of land that it could become houses, but right now nobody's doing that. They want too much for it. The decision was
I was thinking, like, interesting habitat is kind of preserved.
Well, Travis and I had a discussion once about some land that west of us here in the San Felipe Valley that has a donor that is pretty picky. It's immediately adjacent to Fish and Game land, but she won't donate it to them or sell it to them because she doesn't want hunting on it. It comes with a lot of strings in terms of the donor, and it's also outside of the park. It's been offered to the foundation, but it's not easily managed by the park, and probably would have a hard time getting the public works board because it would be taking on additional costs in terms of management. Most of the land that gets approved by the public works board for adding to Anza-borrego at this point are in holdings where we can argue, or the park can argue that it's actually reducing their workload because they don't have to try and figure out where the stupid boundary is in the middle of something that's.
So to segue on that a bit, instead of thinking about how ABF or other, we can receive lands, so we're working a little bit with the foundation right now to ask sort of how can they better think about the land holdings they bring to the park, right? So instead of, I'm halfway to administrator. I've brought things to universities before without budgets, and it's not a pretty thing to do, right? And so it's better that we shepherd it to somebody who can be a better land steward. We'll talk about that tomorrow too.